It's always, and I mean this, always a pleasure for me and an honor to sit down with an author after I've read his book or her book to get their perspective on what they have written. It's one thing to read the book, it's another thing to read the author. To be able to do both, that's awesome. Eric Metaxas is my guest. He has been on the program before. I interviewed him about his book, Everything You Always Want to Know About God, but We're Afraid to Ask, the Jesus edition. And it's a kind of a light and fun and yet strong apologetic book. This one is called Bonhoeffer, Pastor, Martyr, Prophet, Spy, a remarkable biography of one of the most profound Christian thinkers of the 20th century, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who died at the hands of the Nazis because of his opposition to the Nazi regime. Welcome back, Eric. Nice to have you here.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much.
And you know what we're going to do? This man is so important, and I think the book is so important that we're going to do a two-part interview here. So we'll do an interview now, and then we'll continue later. I don't know if it'll be tomorrow, but it'll be relatively soon.
Are we going to do the first part first?
We'll do that.
And the second part second?
We'll do the first part first and the second part second.
Okay. Yes. I need to know the order, otherwise I'll get confused.
Yes, Eric is a humorist as well as a biographer. So we have a lot of time. Let's set it up. Who was Dietrich Bonhoeffer?
The basic facts. I mean, you know, if somebody's not heard of him before, the basic facts are that he was a German pastor and a theologian who got involved in the plot against Adolf Hitler. Bonhoeffer knew from the beginning that the Nazis and Hitler were the enemies, bitter enemies of the church, and he got involved finally in the plot against Hitler, and Bonhoeffer was arrested and hanged by the Nazis at Flossenburg concentration camp in April of 1945, right before the end of the war. He was hanged on the express orders of Hitler. It's ultimately an inspiring, incredibly inspiring story. You wouldn't think of because of the way it ends, but it's just one of those stories. I remember when I first heard it, I was staggered to hear the story. I said, how come I've never heard this before? And I think part of the reason is that we live in a culture, I live in the U.S., where you tend not to hear the positive side of faith. In fact, it's almost comical. Christopher Hitchens, who never met a Christian that he approved of, when he talks about Bonhoeffer, he says, oh, Bonhoeffer's not really a Christian, he's a humanist, which is hilarious. It's hilarious. That's like saying Jesus was a humanist. He wasn't really a Jewish rabbi. I mean, it's actually crazy, but Bonhoeffer is so little known. And I have to say that his story is so inspiring. When I heard it, I said, everybody needs to know this story. But there's another piece of what got me so excited is that I am German. My dad is Greek and my mom is German. I was born in New York City, and the German side of things, my mother was in Germany during the war and lived through this period. So to hear that there was a German man who, because of his faith in Jesus, stood up to the Nazis, it just really got me so excited. I never dreamt that I'd be writing a biography about Bonhoeffer. But
now, what I didn't realize until reading the biography, how many Christians in Germany did oppose Hitler and did oppose the Nazi regime, and we'll have time to get into some of that. Bonhoeffer is known, to those who know him, for The Cost of Discipleship, which maybe is his classic book, or at least that's how it's seen.
Yeah.
Life Together, a little, almost a pamphlet. It's just a short little book on what it means to be together as a community of believers.
Right.
And then he wrote something that I haven't read. I've read the other two. I haven't read his Ethics.
Yeah.
You say his Ethics may be his greatest work.
Well, I mean, that's not my judgment. I mean, I think that he himself and others feel that, you know, it's his magnum opus, it's his big book, his final book. But yeah, I should have mentioned earlier that he's famous for having written The Cost of Discipleship. Yeah. I mean, the German title is Nachfolge, which just means discipleship. But it's a book that literally millions of people have read it, and it has changed people's lives. It's one of those books that when you read it, you think, this is a classic. I mean, it is a classic. If you want to get closer to God, you read that book. And when I came to faith seriously in 1988, the man who led me to faith gave me a copy of Cost of Discipleship. And I thought, well, what's this and who's Bonhoeffer? And he told me the story, and that's when I was just so amazed. But it's that book, The Cost of Discipleship, that is so well known. There's a little tiny few pages in the beginning of The Cost of Discipleship that tells you Bonhoeffer's life, but there really, so many people have so many questions about Bonhoeffer. There was a huge biography written about him over 40 years ago by his best friend, Eberhard Bethge. I met Eberhard Bethge's widow in Germany just a couple of years ago. My wife and I had the privilege of meeting with her. She's Bonhoeffer's niece, and she is a figure. She figures in this book. She's a character in what happened. But she's now in her 80s, and her husband wrote this huge biography, but it's 1,100 pages long. It's very scholarly, and I thought somebody needs to write a story for everybody, because there's more here. I mean, it's more fascinating than I realized. I mean, this guy lived 5 lifetimes or 10 lifetimes in one. It's just, there's so much. But I wanted to tell the story in a fun way that, you can really learn the history of the Third Reich and the Christian witness in Nazi Germany. I didn't know this going into it, and I have to say, it's an amazing story. I had no idea about this.
What astonishes me is this man's accomplishments, not only as a pastor, but as an intellectual and as an academic.
Oh yeah.
And as a witness for the truth in a very dark period of history. And he's only 39 when he dies.
Yeah.
He was just a young man.
Oh, it's truly amazing. You talk about somebody who was a genius. We say that lightly. He was a genius. He got his doctorate in theology at age 21. His whole family were geniuses. His father was the most famous psychiatrist in Germany for the first half of the 20th century. He was a national figure, a very big deal in Germany and in Europe in scientific and medical circles. Bonhoeffer grew up in a family that prized learning, that prized clear thinking, rigorous, logical thinking, and he really brought that to the world of theology. And when the Nazis rose to power, he applied his great mind to trying to explain to the church and to church leaders why Nazi ideology was fundamentally incompatible with Christianity. And it's easy for us to say, well, of course. Well, not of course, because in 1933, the Nazis weren't the Nazis. Hitler wasn't Hitler. We know things about Hitler and the Nazis in retrospect that no German knew in 1933. But Bonhoeffer intuited where it all was going. He could see from what they said immediately that this was incompatible. Just their idea of along racial lines, their looking at the Jews purely racially. There were many Jews in Germany, I talk about this in the book, who were baptized Christians. But because they were ethnically Jewish, because their blood was Jewish blood, the Nazis said, well, you cannot be in the church. You cannot. And that's when Bonhoeffer said, no. It's your faith that makes you a Christian, not your blood. Gentiles aren't Christians. Germans aren't Christians. It's your faith in Christ. And he had to think this thing through for the rest of the church, because the church was really fooled. We have to be honest that there were many Christians, many pseudo-Christians, many nominal Christians who were really fooled by the Nazis. Bonhoeffer was a heroic figure who saw from the beginning that the church needed to take a stand. The church needed to draw a line in the sand and say, no, we are the church. We will not allow these doctrines to infiltrate us. It was a real battle. He was one of the leaders in that battle.
You mentioned his genius family. His family and his home life figured largely in his life, for all of his life.
Yes, that's a big part of the book. I have to say, I didn't realize, going into it, how important his family was to who Bonhoeffer was. That's why the book is a long book, because there's so much that I think is important to really understand him. You can't look at him in a vacuum. He doesn't make any sense. It's not even an interesting story if you look at him in a vacuum. You have to look at him in the larger context of the Nazis, the rise of the Nazis, but in the beginning of his life, in the context of his family, because it was his family that shaped Bonhoeffer. We can't just say, well, he became a Christian and that solved all his problems. That's sort of that, Christians always act like it's that simple. Well, in his case, many of his values, most of his values, his commitment to truth, his commitment to rigorous thinking, clear, critical thinking, which is a Christian virtue, but it's often not represented as a Christian virtue. He got that from his family. His mother was quite a serious Christian, but his father brought him this idea that you think things through. You don't think sloppily, you don't think with your emotions, think things through. And let's face it, as Christians, if the faith can't stand up to rigorous thinking, well, maybe we need to adjust our faith, because